Thanks so much to all my patrons. Join now to help support the channel and help pick the books I review on this channel. Link in the description. And I am done. Okay, so I just got done reading Shogun by James Clavell, or Clavell, I don't know. And I want to give you my unedited thoughts upon finishing this book, which was literally just right now. So I really like this one, which I don't think is a big surprise. I feel like basically everybody that reads this thing really likes it, especially in the fantasy booktube community. And I'm going to give it a 4.5 out of 5, which is surprising to a lot of you because in my TBR contest I think about half of you thought that I would give it a 5, and the 4.5 was considerably lower than that. But yeah, I had a major gripe in this that impacted my decision. But, you know, I feel like it's a strong book that I really, really liked a lot. So let's back up a little bit and cover why did I jump back into Matt's historical fiction reviews instead of sticking to Matt's fantasy book reviews. And the big reason was that this book was picked for me by the TBR contest. Not the TBR contest, by my Patreon raffle wheel. So every month on Patreon, I spin a big wheel, and anybody on my Patreon gets to pick a book on that wheel, and if it gets picked, I gotta read it. And I don't have a limitation on what kind of book it can be. I do have a limitation on it being, like, way too long, and this one was kind of on the cusp. I think the only reason I allowed this one to go on was because I wanted to read it already. Normally I say, like, it's got to be under 1,000 pages, and this one was like 1,200, 1,300. A lot. It was big. It was a chunky boy. Not the biggest book I've ever read, but certainly getting up there. And this was also a book written back in the 1970s. I think the late 70s, I think is right. Maybe mid to late 70s. I'm pretty sure it was in the 70s. And I found that a couple things. One, I'm a big history nerd, big history buff. Before I got really back into fantasy, I was reading pretty exclusively history books, not historical fiction, but like history books. I'm a big history buff. And so the historical fiction thing comes easy to me because I already love history. And the fiction part brings up a lot of the same stories and the same themes that I enjoy out of my fantasy novels. So blending them is really easy for me. And there's also this aspect, and I don't quite understand what it is. I'm sure somebody smarter than me could describe it in much better. But for whatever reason, there seems to be a large crossover between those that enjoy fantasy and those that enjoy historical fiction. I don't know if those that enjoy historical fiction enjoy fantasy, but I can say a lot of fantasy people do also like historical fiction. Something about it appeals. And I think the best way I could describe it, and again, this is probably a very bad way to describe it, but in the best historical fiction books that I've read, it's like all it's missing is a dragon for it to be, this like political fantasy thriller. And it lacks these fantasy elements, but all of the other things are there that we love out of our fantasy books. The backstabbing, the twists, the turns, the deep character studies. And that's what historical fiction is. A lot of it is. I'm sure historical fiction covers everything. So, I felt like I was really going to like this book, and I did. And as I'm reading this thing, pretty quickly, within the first chapter, I was all in. I mean, this was right up my alley. It involves sailors on boats. I mean, I love boats. I mean, I do like pirates a little more than just like regular sailing ships, but, I love a boat in my book. And, this covered it. I mean, a central plot point about this book was not only when they came to Japan, but the boat that they wanted to get back throughout the book and sinking another ship. Ship battles? Yeah, sign me up. Like, my favorite thing in Disneyland, like, my specifically favorite thing in Disneyland is the room in the Pirates of the Caribbean ride where the ship is fighting in a battle against a fort. The best thing in Disneyland. And I love Disneyland. So it's not like I'm saying I don't like it and that's the only good thing. Like, that's the best of the great things that are there. But so yeah, it's got a ton of things I love. Right out of the gate, loved it. And I just got enraptured in the story. And the basic story And it's a pretty basic story, but it involves this character who is an Englishman on a ship that's a mix of Englishmen, but mostly Dutch. And they are the first ship that made it to Japan. Now, that's not the first Western ship that made it to Japan. Before that, Spanish and Portuguese were there, but not long before that. But this was the first from England, and it centers around this one English character, the only Englishman that has survived. The journey had 4 or 5 of these huge trading ships, and then they all got sunk except for one, and consolidated the crews, and they limped in, and they took this wonderful route going not to the east around Africa, but to the west around Magellan's Pass down South America. And once they get there, pretty quickly on, and I won't ruin anything else beyond this, but I think most people kind of know the gist of the story already, or a little bit about what it's about, even if they haven't read it. But this Englishman gets caught up in this huge battle between these rivals, these 2 major rivals that are trying to take over Japan. These 2 hugely influential characters that are based on real people. And he ends up kind of siding with one of them, getting sucked up and becoming a key advisor. And you get to see the story through this person's lens, not only his lens, but mostly his lens, as he learns to adapt to this culture, understand about them, try to get his ship back, and try to help this one character win the battle that is soon to come, so that they can become the Shogun. And although in the book they're not trying to become Shogun, but clearly they're going to become eventually, because that's the title of the book. And that's awesome. I love this. I love it for so many reasons. The plot is wonderful. This idea that not only do we get this really fun political backstabbing, crazy story, but it's true, which makes it so much better, or at least, in large part true. But you also, because of this, and because of the lens of this character that does not understand this Japanese samurai culture, you as the reader get to understand and learn it from his lens too, and not in an info-dumpy kind of way. You get to learn it by osmosis as he's learning it. That's really fun. I love that kind of thing. It's wonderful storytelling. It works so well. And so you get these dueling aspects that are really, really fun. And you feel like you're getting smarter about a piece of history as you're reading this story, as all great historical fictions will do. So that's great. And as the story progresses along, it has this promise that the story sets up, a very explicit promise that we are going to see what happens in this major conflict, because the book is all about this brewing conflict. But as the book gets going along and we start getting further along, I started to get worried because the page count was quickly dwindling. I was getting towards the end, and the battle had not come. And it became obvious as the story goes along and a major event happens towards the end of the book that was the major event that was going to end the story, and the battle is not going to be told. In fact, at the very end, the book wraps up with I don't want to say what kind of ending it is because I don't want to ruin anything for you, but the book wraps up, and then you get literally like one short paragraph in italics at the end that explains what happened in the battle and what happened in the aftermath of the battle. That is disappointing. It's disappointing. And I get that maybe that's something that a lot of people really enjoyed out of the book. Because it's not a story about the battle. It's a story about what happened before that. But I disliked it for a lot of reasons. I'll start with the fact that I kind of hinted at before, which is I felt like as the reader, we got a promise on what this story would be about. And while I do understand and can appreciate that, like, what is the point? Is the point the journey, or is the point the destination? And clearly here, the point was the journey. But I also felt like the author kind of lied to the reader about what the story was about. And it was severely disappointing. I also feel like it was rushed. And I think that the author wrote it the way that he wanted to on purpose. I don't think I'm sure that it wasn't rushed, but it felt that way when I was reading it, the way it got presented. It felt like We had so much intricate detail, deep, intricate detail about this huge conflict. And it wasn't just a character study, because a lot of character studies, that would make sense. It's not about that. It's about these people. But there was I'd say the bigger part than the character study was this political dynamic between the different daimyos, or however you say that term, the different leaders of Japan, and the infighting, and who's siding with whom, and, who's hiding what, and what's actually happening. And it ultimately, that was not important. And we didn't even get to see what happened in the conflict. And it would be so easy to tack on either an extra 200 to 300 pages to describe the conflict and the aftermath of it, or take out 200 or 300 pages of the deep, rich detail that was going in on things that ultimately didn't matter to the plot. They mattered to the characters. Either one of those, I think, would have been fine. Obviously, for me, who doesn't have a problem with page counts, that's not a superiority thing by any means. It's just my personal taste. I don't mind when a book's really long. I like it because it's more of a story that I like. If it was a bad book, I'd hate a really long book. But I can always stop reading a bad book. But unfortunately, a really wonderful book ends eventually, and I would prefer that never to end, ideally. If something like A Song of Ice and Fire was like 1,000,000 pages, that'd be wonderful, right? I could just keep reading this awesome thing over and over, or never have to read it over. I could just keep going and never find out what the ending is. I guess that's kind of what okay, well, I guess George is smart, because that's kind of what happened in a roundabout way. He didn't write the pages, but we don't know what the ending is. But yeah, that was a severe disappointment, to say the least. And I also get probably a rebuttal to this is like, well, Matt, this is a historical book, and that is the ending of that character's story. Okay, I'm going to have to take your word for it, because I don't know the history. I do know who won the battle, because it told me, and it was pretty easy to infer that. But I don't know what happens with this English character, So maybe he was involved in things where he got to see it from a first-hand perspective. And even if he wasn't, this wasn't told in first person. This was told in third person. There is jumping around in this story from different point of views. And in fact, the latter part of the story stops being mostly from the Englishman's perspective, and it becomes the perspective of Toranaga, the main kind of protagonist of the Japanese conflict, and Mariko. Is that her name, Mariko? There's a lot of names here that are foreign to me, that are hard for me to remember, which is kind of the leading female of this story, or one of the leading females of this story. Females, that sounds weird. Women. And so it wouldn't have felt like a weird tone shift to then go make the main point of view being Toranaga for a while, and wrapping up that part of the conflict. I mean, the book is separated into these things called books. I think it's books or sections or parts. And the last part that wasn't written could have been, its own distinct thing and had its own identity. And that would have been awesome. And I would have eaten it up. But I suspect even those that say, no, this was the perfect ending, that if they got that ending that I'm proposing, that they would have enjoyed it more than what we got. And so, yeah, disappointed. But let's not talk about disappointments, because I gave this 4.5 out of 5. It's an awesome book. I felt like the writing was really, really engaging. And I understand that Clavell isn't known as being like this eloquent writer and like this, perfect prose, but it worked really well for the story. And it especially worked well in this story, which I think was probably a monumental task for somebody like him, or maybe he has this deep, rich knowledge of the history before he went into this. But to be able to interweave the learning of Japanese and this, I don't know about perfect, but to me, it felt like a very, very extremely well done and well researched depiction of what the samurai culture was like, was a huge undertaking and extremely impressive what he was able to pull off. It makes me very intrigued about the other books in this series. This is called the Asian series, I believe it's called, or the Asian saga. But disappointingly, It is not following the same timeline, because that would have solved my problem also. If this was book 1, book 2 is about the war. Awesome. Even better. That'd be the best. Take away my idea of 250 pages. Make a second book and make it about that, because it could use probably a lot of length about it. And then write a third one about Toranaga's rule afterwards. That'd have been great. But the Asia saga is about other cultures in Asia and their own distinct stories. I think there's one about China. I don't know the rest, but I think one of them is about China. But I have no idea even what timeline it is about China. So, my guess is it's around the same timeline. But who knows? Because I did not do my research before this. That's not how I really roll. So yeah. Extremely engaging writing, wonderful research, wonderful history piece here, and the story's engaging as well. I felt like the characters were wonderfully done. They were very lifelike, especially the Japanese characters. In this, when you meet them from the perspective of the Westerners, they come off as evil, because they're foreign and because they have a great misunderstanding between the two cultures. But as it goes along, they become humanized. As you start to learn more about them, as you start to understand their language, as the perspective starts to understand what they're trying to infer, you start to learn what makes them who they are and how unique they are and what makes them tick. And so as a character work, it was very well done. I love the drip feeding that was done here. It wasn't in your face. It certainly wasn't here's a character trait. We're just going to, hit that over the head. We're going to kind of hide their character traits because they weren't, especially in the Japanese culture, they have this rigid, I don't know about Japanese culture, but the samurai culture had this very, very rigid culture of these traditions that you had to follow that kind of hid your own self and your own personal identity. But obviously you can't hide that, or it doesn't stop you from being who you are inside. So to learn that in great detail, especially in the relationship between the character and Toranaga and the relationship between this character and Mariko, because you get to see an intimate side and you get to see them behind closed doors where you get to see them, essentially taking off the mask. So that's great too. So ultimately, great stuff. Certainly recommend it. Just with a couple little warnings to people. One is this is huge. It is a very large book. And at least for me, it's hard for me to fly through a historical fiction book. I go a little slower on them than a fantasy book. Sometimes, like a fantasy book will make me stay up all night kind of reading it sometimes. Historical fiction won't do that. I'll fall asleep. And I have to take it in smaller bite-sized chunks. So know that as a warning. And know the other warning is that you're just not going to get an ending. You're going to get an ending, but you're not going to get the ending you wanted. And if you're okay with those things, which I hope that you are, because this is good stuff, great stuff even, then check this out. It's really good. And it's becoming a lot more popular now because I think it's Disney. It's Disney. Disney did a series on Shogun. I'm probably not going to watch it because I don't really watch a lot of TV. But, most of the TV I watch is with my wife, and so we have to find something that's like mutually agreeable. And I feel like Shogun is not something my wife would enjoy. It just not that kind of thing. It's not reality TV, to be honest with you. So that's it for me. I have nothing else to add here. Thank you so much for sticking with this rather long review. And as always, happy reading to you. Thanks again to all my patrons, with a special shout out to my Ascendant tier and Librarian tier patrons: Amy, Anna G, CJ, Doust, Darren, JD, Jonathan, Nathan T, Nev's Book Channel, 𝗟𝗏𝑥ia, Ron Reich, Russell, Ryan L, Slay, Sydney Baker, Tahir, Zion, Anna, Andra, Blair, Brock, Evan, Harry W, Joe UK, Kat Mick, Michael Sugarman, Sky, and Tyler. Thanks for sticking to the end of this video, and if you want to watch some more content from my channel, click over here and I've got some good videos for you. Thanks so much.